Okay, welcome back. I was told at break by one of our students who's probably getting an F in this class that my outfit reminded him of Colonel Sanders. So I would not repeat that, okay? I actually take my fashion hints from televangelists, which I've probably told you before, because ultimately this is my goal in life. Once I get out of history, I want to become a TV minister because these guys just fascinate me, you know? They're incredible, you know? What's that? I watch them, and for 2 or 3 minutes I laugh, and then I find myself watching it like a half hour later. I'm still watching it. They're mesmerizing, you know. I know. I hear a word. So anyway, Jesus has just told me it's time to begin the lecture. What did Robin Williams' great line was? If these guys talk to God, why can't they do something about their wife's goddamn Jiffy Pop hairdo or whatever, you know? Anyway. I have to do that at least once every class. Maybe we can cut this out. We'll see if we can do some editing. Anyway, Czechoslovakia had a history of democracy. There is this kind of movement toward liberalization in Eastern Europe. And in 1968, they have what they call Prague Spring, which means that the intellectuals and the dissidents and the students are out, and they're talking about multi-party elections, and they're talking about democracy, and they're listening to jazz. And there's this real thaw, this kind of opening in Czechoslovakia. Ironically, it's the same thing that a lot of the kids in Chicago, like SDS, are talking about. There's a real parallel here. In both of these countries, there are demands for what we can really call legitimately participatory democracy. In the 60s, a lot of the students were calling for participatory democracy, especially SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. The idea there was simply voting for a hand-picked candidate once every 4 years isn't democracy. Democracy means you have a voice in the decisions that affect your life. You have a voice on whether we should be fighting a war in Vietnam. You have a voice on whether there should be a real war on poverty. You have a say in what the U.S. does with regard to Cuba. And this is what they're saying in Prague as well. So there really is this kind of convergence. And remember, a couple weeks ago, I made the point that in the Cold War, after the kind of everything falls out in the late 40s, what you have are powerful countries trying to maintain, powerful groups within these countries trying to maintain their hegemony. And so in the United States and in the Soviet Union, you have the same forces at play, where they're trying to suppress these demands for democracy, whether they be on the streets of Prague or in the streets of Chicago at the same time. Long story short, the Kremlin fears what's going on in Czechoslovakia. That could spread throughout the bloc. Economic liberalization is one thing. They can live with that. However, this idea of rejecting and renouncing communism won't go. We saw that in '56, remember? You know, Gomulka, even though he says I'm coming to power under an anti-Soviet banner, maintains Poland's status in the Warsaw Pact and doesn't change the communist form of government. Imre Nagy says he's going to. He's ousted. In 1968, Brezhnev by this time has solidified power. Brezhnev is kind of a return to the kind of more old school Stalinist approach. So Brezhnev sends the tanks into Prague and they crush Prague Spring. They end the liberalization movement and maintain into power the Soviet-sponsored leadership of Czechoslovakia. All right. At that point, Brezhnev issues the Brezhnev Doctrine. You know, the U.S. has all these doctrines. Brezhnev says that whenever a communist or socialist country is being threatened by world imperialism, then the Soviet Union has the right to intervene to save that country. This is the Brezhnev Doctrine. What does Johnson do? How does Johnson react? He cancels a summit with Brezhnev. Now, you got to admit, on the surface, this is kind of ironic. The leader of a government which not only has conducted Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago, but is conducting a war in Vietnam, as well as what it's doing in Latin America, decides that Brezhnev doesn't have the political purity to talk to because of what he's done in Czechoslovakia, right? So Johnson, there are a lot of historians who are considered realists. There's a realist school. And realists say the U.S. gets too moral. They start moralizing too much. Realists had a field day with this. How the hell can Johnson cancel a summit meeting over what Brezhnev did in Czechoslovakia when the U.S. is doing the same thing in Vietnam? Nonetheless, it happened. So there's a real break, a real schism in U.S.-Soviet relations. And I set this up because this is what Nixon inherits when he becomes president. And he does a fairly decent job of it. it's hard. I mean, on one hand, you can look at what Nixon did, détente and ending the Vietnam War, and a lot of people have painted a very positive picture of him. I think that's misguided because there is there are kind of many fields of strewn bodies and lost credibility along the way. Nonetheless, Nixon understands that Vietnam is ruining everything. He does understand that. He gets it. Henry Kissinger is his national security advisor. Nixon and Kissinger both get it. They know that they have to manage the Soviet Union differently. There is a decline in American power. In addition to that, Soviet strength has increased. I mean, these things operate together, right? It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. But as American power and credibility decline, then clearly the Soviet Union is going to improve its standing in the world, not just strategically or strategically, or however the president would say it, strategery, but it would also gain credibility, okay? So, I mean, strategically, it's not being bogged down in a war like the Americans are in Vietnam, although later you'll see that in Afghanistan. But in terms of credibility, it's gaining as well, because as the world says, look at what the Americans are doing in Vietnam, the Soviet Union can then kind of maintain this mantle of liberation. So Vietnam is just bad news on so many different levels. And if you really want to look into, why did the U.S. lose, and you have to take all this into account. I mean, it's so simple and facile to say we weren't allowed to win. We had to fight with one hand tied behind our back. Walter Cronkite lost the war. All those damn hippies and flag burners, lost the war. And that ignores so much else that's going on, especially in the world. I mean, and Nixon realizes that. Nixon will talk about the students all the time, and he will use that as a foil. But realistically, Nixon knows that the international balance of power has shifted now against the United States, and Vietnam has to change. It has to stop. You can't maintain this hemorrhage of money and men in Vietnam. It just kind of throws everything off. And there's also an economic crisis going on, which is really important, which I'll talk about in a minute. So they understand the world has changed. The United States now has to deal with the Soviet Union as a world power and contain the Soviet Union in the world, not just in Eastern Europe, because Soviet strength and Soviet prestige has increased. In Eastern Europe, it has, its sphere of influence. But in addition to that, it's gotten into Cuba. It is seen as a liberator now for its support of the Castro regime. It is going into Africa and supporting liberation and nationalist movements there. It is supporting Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese in their movement for liberation. So the Soviet Union is assuming this mantle of liberation, just like Mao Zedong or Fidel Castro would. So what does Nixon do? Nixon plays this very cleverly. He decides that he will look for a program of détente. There should be an accent mark, I believe, on the first E, but I didn't feel like going through the program to do that. Détente basically is just accommodation, getting along, peace, that kind of thing. And he will do this very cleverly by playing what he terms the China card. Nixon understands, and we talked about this, remember, last week or the week before. In the late 50s, there is finally an open break between the Soviet Union and China. That picture of Mao and Stalin, right? That's not applicable anymore. The Let 100 Flowers Bloom campaign in the late 50s really unleashes a strong torrent of anti-Soviet rhetoric and ideas in China. And then the Soviet Union is harshly critical of the Cultural Revolution, which is unleashed in China in the 60s, which initially is aimed to eradicate Western influences, but gets out of control, even out of Mao's control, and becomes this bloodbath where people are taken away from their families and many are killed simply because they are not adequately communist, they are not revolutionary enough. And in fact, China withdraws from the rest of the world, closes all its embassies except for Albania. So Nixon and Kissinger understand that, we can talk about the communist monolith all we want, but the world is different. It's not that clear cut. So what Nixon's going to do is play China and the Soviet Union off against each other by opening relationships with both. Okay, so both then will have an incentive to negotiate with the U.S., to work with the U.S., to create a new relationship with the U.S. as a way of not allowing the other to get an undue advantage. They're going to use this with regard to Vietnam too. Now Nixon understands, as I've said already several times, you can't do any of this so long as you're tied down in Vietnam. Nixon does a couple things. Nixon does a lot of things. He begins a process of phased withdrawal. What were the numbers by 71 down to what, 140,000?
I think down by 140,000.
No, I think it was down to 140,000 actually. I believe it was.
And then we pulled up the first, we pulled out 60 or so thousand. I thought it was the next year that it was down 100,000.
No, I think it was tremendous. I think it was a really rapid phase withdrawal. Point is, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. The point is, within a year or two, you start to see American troops coming out of Vietnam rapidly. Now, does that mean Nixon's winding down the war? In a sense, he is, but not really, because he's also extending it. And he conducts massive air operations in Laos and Cambodia, the associated countries, and this unleashes the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields and everything else. There's actually a link there. Don't worry about that now. The point is, Nixon begins a phased withdrawal. It is his way of saying, this war isn't going well, we need to get out. He does this via a program of Vietnamization, which you talked about. Okay? Vietnamization means you make this a Vietnamese war. John Kerry, in this famous speech that is so controversial, talks about the arrogance of American leaders who need to Vietnamize the Vietnamese War, which I think Kerry's right on target. This was 1971. He would never talk, that way today. But the point here is that Nixon says, this is their war, they're going to have to fight it. Now, that doesn't mean the U.S. isn't going to do anything. It's going to sell another. The U.S. will continue to pay for this and conduct massive air operations. All right? So it's not necessarily war on the cheap, but it's clearly a far different program. Critics of Vietnamization, like George McGovern, said we're going to change the color of the corpses instead of American boys being killed, which is Nixon's real concern. The anti-war movement, Nixon was really clear and clever. He thought, and he was basically right, that the anti-war movement would dissipate if Americans were withdrawn and the number of Americans killed, went down. And in fact, the number of Americans killed in the Nixon years was actually quite high. It wasn't all that much different than what had been killed prior to that. But Nixon, after 1969, essentially does contain the anti-war movement. There are two really big demos in late 69, the moratorium and the MOB, and over 1 million participated in both of those. In fact, the majority of Americans continued to question, criticize, or oppose the war. However, you never had the kind of strong anti-war demonstrations. Okay, especially after Kent State in 1970, which you're well aware is quite ugly. So Nixon essentially, by this process of Vietnamization, is able to convince people that the U.S. is ending the war in Vietnam. Now, there are kind of two schools of thought. In the piece that I gave you, which I wrote like 5 years ago or so, I basically take the decent interval analysis, which basically says that Nixon wanted to get out, but he simply wanted to give it some time so that it didn't look bad. A decent interval before the war finally ended. He knew they were going to lose, and so he wanted to create a decent interval before the Americans actually had to withdraw in failure. There's kind of more current analyses coming out by other historians which suggest that actually Nixon wanted to keep it going. He wanted to win that thing, or he wanted to maintain South Vietnam as an independent entity. And only Watergate prevented him from doing so. And I think there may be some validity to that. Either way, Nixon clearly does not and is not willing or capable of maintaining the kind of commitment LBJ had. 542,000 troops and this massive hemorrhaging of men and money in Vietnam. Nixon won't do that. He understands that. If you want, if the U.S. is going to be the global power, it can't be bogged down in a little Southeast Asian state. Johnson and Nixon had similar views. They referred to Vietnam as a pissant state, and Kissinger called them, tawdry, filthy little shits and stuff like that. And they had nothing but disdain for Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, So they can't understand how a global power could be bogged down there, but they also understand that if you're going to be a global power, you got to get out of that. You got to somehow disengage from Vietnam because it's simply dragging you down. It's past the point where you have to think about why it happened. Let's just get out and move on. So Nixon understands you can't maintain global power so long as you're tied down in Vietnam. So he develops the Nixon Doctrine. The Nixon Doctrine says that the U.S. is going to have to pull back. It can't continue to guard the world, police the world, be hegemonic everywhere. And it's going to have to help friends take up the burden of containment. In Asia, Japan. In the Middle East, Iran. In Africa, South Africa, Zaire. The point here is that Nixon understands now that the U.S. has to pull back. There are limits. He is really the first post-war president to recognize the limits of American power. Now, there's a difference between saying that American power is limited and saying that it's not hegemonic. Nixon is in no way relinquishing American hegemony or American imperium. That's not an issue. The point here is that he understands that it can't do everything it once did or thought it once did. Okay? So in Latin America, what's he doing? He's letting these right-wing dictatorships kind of have their way, right? You keep stability there, and we'll take, we'll overthrow Allende if we need to, that kind of thing. In Vietnam, it's basically, we'll give the South Vietnamese what they need, and it's their game now, right? We'll give them a lot. We'll give them airplanes, especially, and we'll fly the hell out of, Laos and Cambodia, but basically it's now theirs, right? In the Middle East, we'll give the Shah of Iran everything he wants and a bag of chips, but he's in charge. We're not going to do it. He's our cop there, along with Israel. So all of this is Nixon's view of the world. And the centerpiece of that is going to be the Soviet Union and China. Now, I could spend a whole lot of time on this. Basically, what Nixon and Kissinger do is open relationships with both, okay, virtually at the same time. The goal here is to play them off, the so-called China card. The U.S. and Soviet Union had been, talking for a long time. They don't get along, but they've had a relationship. They have ambassadors, and they have, like the '67 summit in Glassboro. They've have a relationship that's clear. I mean, they meet at the UN. They're both members of the Security Council. All right. China, however, it doesn't, right? China's ostracized. Does China have a vote at the UN? Does it even have a vote at the UN? No. Who has the vote? Taiwan does, right? So China, the biggest country in the world, doesn't exist. As far as the UN's concerned, it doesn't exist, which is really quite ridiculous, right? Does the US have an ambassador in Beijing? No, it has an interest section. And in fact, I believe George Bush Sr. was the kind of the equivalent of the ambassador there at one time. But it doesn't have actual relations. So what Nixon decides to do is to make contact with China. He initially does this by sending Kissinger through the back channel secret meetings with the Chinese, with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, to start opening the relationship. Now, and at the very beginning when I talked about Nixon, I talked about his role in McCarthyism in the Cold War. So this is one of the great ironies which people are always talking about, that Nixon, the guy who was so much responsible for the Cold War and for this anti-communist hysteria, becomes the guy who makes these overtures to the People's Republic of China and Mao Zedong. Right? I mean, Nixon's the guy who wanted to overthrow Mao when he came to power, who attacked Truman for allowing Mao, for losing China, right? And now Nixon is the guy who's opening these relations. Why is he doing that? Is he suddenly like Mao Zedong? Does he suddenly think Mao is misunderstood? After the Cultural Revolution? Of course not. China can be played off against the USSR. The USSR, if it fears that the United States will develop a relationship with China, will have to become more malleable and more flexible. And part of that means that now the Soviet Union will be less willing to help out the Vietnamese, because they have just like the United States has more important things than Vietnam to worry about, so do the Vietnamese. So if the Vietnamese have an opportunity to create a new relationship with the U.S., with this China card looming, then is Vietnam going to be that important? Not really. Vietnam, the Soviet Union, the Russians kind of got a raw deal in Vietnam. They actually spent way more money. I forget how much it was, billions of dollars in rubles in Vietnam. And basically, they did a lot to help Ho Chi Minh. There's no doubt about that. They had advisors there. They delivered tons and tons and tons of supplies. Right? At the end of the day, didn't get a whole lot out of it. And in fact, finally, the Soviet Union says, you know what? Having a decent relationship with the U.S. is more important than supporting the Vietnamese. So Vietnam essentially becomes isolated this way by Nixon. It doesn't matter because they win the war. A good example of that, to kind of make it clear, is in northern Vietnam, I don't feel like going to the map, but in North Vietnam there's a port called Haiphong. And Haiphong was the site where, Haiphong, should I do one of my famous maps? Which are not nearly as good as his. You went to that art school from the matchbook cover, right? Do they still have those? Yeah. It's an exact replica, right? And that's the 17th parallel. Right around here, there's a place called Haiphong. What? Oh, I thought you meant move Haiphong down. That's exactly where it is. That big act. The Soviet Union delivered a lot of supplies to Ho Chi Minh, to the DRVN, to northern Vietnam, and after Ho died, Pham Minh Dong, through Haiphong. There were American military officials who kept saying, we've got to bomb Haiphong. Johnson always refused. Why? Okay. Why did Johnson refuse to bomb Haiphong Harbor? To mine or bomb Haiphong? He didn't want to bring the Soviet Union or China into the war. Now, is this a sign of weakness? I mean, come on. Think about this in larger context. Are you really willing, and is it really smart to risk a war against the Soviet Union over Vietnam? Yeah, push the...
Maybe possible that someone learned from the Korean example where we pushed a little too far,
Well, I mean, and in fact, LBJ brought that up all the time. What are you going to do when the volunteers come in? He said that repeatedly. Basically, and neither James nor I talked about this. There's a whole theory of limited war that's really popular in the 60s, right? Limited war. I mean, Korea is essentially limited war. The idea there is Eisenhower is projecting a doctrine of total war, massive retaliation. There's really no incrementalism, right? You're either like nuking the hell out of them with the airplanes, the B-29s or the B-52s, or you really don't do anything, covert ops in Guatemala. But there's no middle ground, right? You either, covertly overthrow the government or you just nuke the hell out of them. Well, you can't really nuke the hell out of them, especially as the Soviet Union and other countries develop nuclear forces. So you develop a limited war doctrine. And this is essentially what you see in Korea. When MacArthur takes steps to expand the war, what happens? Boom, 500,000 volunteers, most of whom aren't even armed, flood over the Yalu River and scare the hell out of everybody, right? They take prisoners to Manchuria, they brainwash them, they think they're at a tea party. It's quite a gas. No one's seen the original. God, I'm an old man. If you ever get a chance, The Manchurian Candidate is out. If you ever get a chance, watch the original. It is an amazing movie. It's one of the most incredible films you'll ever see. Oh, yeah, I'm not even going to go see this one. I just can't, I don't want to deal with it. But it's just incredible. But, and it's actually about that. So, in a sense, Vietnam is a limited war. And Johnson understands that, right? Is it really smart to risk a war with the Soviet Union over Vietnam? No. But the Vietnamese feel the same way. So they're willing now to cut the same deal, to make the same decision. So Nixon in '72 mines Haiphong Harbor. What does the Soviet Union do? Nothing. And this kind of ties into the whole Cold War thing. Whenever confronted, what do? Nothing, right? Basically, the Soviet Union comes to the same conclusion. It's not worth pissing away a solid relationship with the U.S., especially when they're hanging this China threat against us over Vietnam, right? So Nixon, as a result of playing the China card, as a result of détente, is able to do things in Vietnam that Johnson never could have done. So this also, I think, ties into the whole kind of Johnson fought with one hand tied behind his back. I actually don't agree with that. I think, and I have documents actually which indicate that the air war was actually quite devastating. The air war hit pretty much every target that was available in Vietnam. And just as the strategic bombing survey after World War II concluded, didn't really matter all that much. For the most part, you don't win wars through the air. And I think what we're seeing today in Iraq is kind of instructive in that. The U.S. bombed the hell out of Iraq, right? Has that secured the peace? I mean, clearly no. I mean, the U.S. isn't going to go into Fallujah and Mosul and drop B-52s, not unless it wants to just, create another full-blown war there. So you can't really do that. So Nixon is able to have a different context. So he can attack Hanoi, he can bomb Hanoi, he can mine Haiphong, because he's made these overtures to the Soviet Union and, more importantly, played this China card. Ultimately, the U.S. will do this openly. The first move is actually he sends an American ping pong team, a table tennis team, to China to play a series of exhibition matches, kind of a cultural opening. After that, Kissinger and Nixon actually visit the People's Republic of China, which is stunning. And Richard Nixon utters those famous words, which probably every high school senior smoking his first joint would have said. As he looks at the Great Wall of China, Nixon says, "It is indeed a great wall." Hunter Thompson he had a field day with that one. Anyway, I think Hunter Thompson said, "What was Nixon smoking at the time?" It is indeed a great wall. At any rate, I guess if you're of a certain age, that's very funny. But Nixon's, you talk to your parents or grandparents or whoever about Nixon. It's just, the guy just evokes. He's kind of like Clinton in that regard, You got to feel something about him. You can't be nonchalant about Nixon. You have to either love him or hate him or be somewhere in between or just get a kick out of everything the guy did. He used to go on the beach. He had a vacation house in San Clemente on the Pacific Ocean in California. He would walk on the beach in his wingtips in his black suit, The guy just never chilled out. It's really quite incredibly paranoid if you know anything about Watergate. I would recommend, if you haven't seen it, the movie Dick, starring Kirsten Dunst and the Saturday Night Live people, because it's probably the best film on Watergate I've seen. It's better than All the President's Men. At any rate, he's really an incredible guy, but in his own way, he gets it. He's not stupid. He's very smart, but he's also demented. I mean, he and Kissinger played what they called the madman game. Kissinger would go to the Vietnamese and to the Russians and to the Chinese and say, you know what, I want to create a stable world, but you know, Nixon's mad. He's crazy. I don't know what he's going to do. He might drop the bomb. He's a madman. It's a good cop, bad cop kind of thing, you know. So basically, you know, Kissinger said, I can't control him. I'm trying to. I think I have him under control, but he's a madman. I don't know what he's going to do. And use this as a way to kind of frighten and coerce. I really doubt it worked all that well because, you know, you're not going to, if you're playing poker with Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and Leonid Brezhnev, it's going to be really hard to kind of bluff them. But at the same time, I mean, the fact that he would do this indicates, you know, that the guy really has kind of a very Machiavellian as well as a developed sense of global relations. So Nixon is able to do all this. I mean, and in a sense, he pulls it off. I mean, Watergate kind of kills everything, but in a sense, he pulls this off. Gets out of Vietnam. Finally withdraws in January of 1973, although he keeps spending money there to buttress this entity below the 17th parallel. Develops decent relations with the Soviet Union and China, and in fact gets a strategic arms limitation agreement, gets an agreement to regulate nuclear weapons, which is a major accomplishment. Pulls that off. Is able to open relations with China, and ultimately China will take the Taiwan seat at the UN, brings China into the global system. Right? These are not insignificant and small developments, small accomplishments. You know, ending the Vietnam War, you know, détente and strategic arms limitation, bringing China in. Okay, and this all stems from a realization the Vietnam War has been a mess. Now, you know, and a lot of people have used that to proclaim Nixon this great, brilliant foreign policy leader. Juxtaposed against that has to be Cambodia, Laos, Chile, Cuba, the Alliance for Progress, military juntas, Indonesia, you know, places like that. But clearly it you know, indicates that the guy, you know, does have this kind of perception of the world. Now something else, okay, any questions on that? Because I want to kind of jump back now. Like I said, doing this chronologically would be just disastrous, so. In addition to Nixon understanding that Vietnam had changed everything, I think more importantly, Nixon understood that the world economy had changed as well. And Vietnam had engendered a huge global economic crisis. This is Econ 101. It's going to bore you. I don't think it's going to confuse you. I don't think it's that complicated. You're supposed to begin every discussion of economics with, this stuff's really complicated, and I don't think it is. And again, I mean, it's like alchemy. It's difficult because you say it is. And that's a way that experts justify, you know, not telling people things. Well, you would never understand this. Well, in fact, you can. You guys can understand this, you know. If I can understand, I've never taken an economics course in my life. Granted, the other day I was at a coffee house for about an hour and a half with a headache trying to figure this all out with the calculator and things. But the point is I did get it, I hope. Although I fear putting this up here on TV for the world to see because somebody's going to call me and say, God, you couldn't be more wrong. At any rate, I want to talk a little about the economy because in the end, this is the major factor in the limits on American power, the decline of American power, whatever you want to call it. The world changes as a result of Vietnam, not just because the U.S. lost in Vietnam, because ultimately I don't think that was all that important, although in the 70s I sure as hell thought the world had changed. In fact, it hasn't. I mean, clearly what we've seen, you know, in the Gulf indicates that the lessons of Vietnam, you know, whether good or bad, haven't necessarily been that long-lived. However, I think the economic issues, and this gets to the whole concept of globalization and the open door, are more important. All right? Remember, kind of to go back a little bit, and I don't want to go over this again. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the U.S. creates a new global system. World Bank, IMF, and the other part of that, which I talked about, was they created the dollar as the world's currency. This is a way to facilitate global trade. If you want to trade, you can use your currencies. We will accept the dollar in exchange for your currency, and all of that will be pegged to a gold standard. All right? Anywhere, any place, any government, any central bank in the world, if it has dollars, can use those. And if it wants to, it can trade those dollars in for gold. at a par value of $35 per ounce of gold. This is the Bretton Woods system. Any place that has dollars can use them. Now, this creates the so-called dollar gap that we talked about. Europe and Asia don't have the dollars they need to conduct the level of trade they would need for reconstruction. So the American goal then is to get dollars into these lands. How does it do that? How does the U.S. address the so-called dollar gap after World War II? The Marshall Plan is a great example of that. NSC 68, military aid. What the foreign aid programs, right? With Nixon, remember? Nixon says they don't have to buy American goods. The presumption before that meaning that they had to take this money and buy American goods. So there is a dollar gap problem. The world needs dollars. Why? To conduct trade. Global trade will be based on the dollar, which will be fully convertible to gold and to other currencies. Right? The example I use here down below is, it says 1 pound equal 280. I'm going to use Britain, the pound, the whole time because I knew what the exchange rate was and I didn't want to have to look any one of the other ones up. So for instance, and actually this is the 1960s, I believe the value after World War II may have been a bit different, but for instance, if you have a pound, a British pound sterling, it is worth $2.80, okay? That is a fixed exchange rate. So a pound is worth $2.80, $35 is worth an ounce. Those are all fixed. Currencies are all adjusted according to the value of the dollar. They do not float. Floating currencies are what we have today. If you look at the economics page, right, the business page, or if you go to an internet site, you can find the value of a euro, right? I think a euro is what, 121. It had been $1.28. I think it's gone down a bit. You can find the value of a franc, a yen, a mark, a lira, a peso, whatever. And they'll change, sometimes with great rapidity, because we have floating exchange rates. Currencies are valued now against other currencies. Their value is adjusted according to what they will buy vis-a-vis other currencies. You don't have that here, which is why this stuff's easy to understand. Frankly, floating exchange rates are crazy. I don't really understand them. Those are somewhat complicated. This isn't. This is fixed. So $2.80 is always going to buy you a pound sterling, all right? And $35 is always going to get you an ounce of gold if you're a central bank. Okay, so this is the World War II Bretton Woods system. It's not that hard. 1968, the thing's falling apart. All right? At the same time the Tet Offensive occurs, something I think far more important occurs, and that is a global economic crisis. And ultimately, this is why the United States is going to have to end the Vietnam War. Ultimately, this is why Nixon is going to have to create a new global system, because the U.S. can no longer pay for the burdens of empire, in large measure because it really shoots its load in Vietnam. It misjudges badly. All right? In 1968, there is a global, and you mentioned this earlier, a crisis regarding both gold and BOP. It's an acronym I use all the time. Balance of payments. Okay. Can you see that? Balance of payments refers to the amount of money going overseas in the form of investment by American companies investing abroad, in the form of military spending, which is huge in the 60s, not only in Vietnam, but to sustain these bases all over the world, Germany and everywhere, right? And trade deficit, commercial transactions. Now, ideally, in any situation, do you want to be in a deficit or in a surplus? You don't need to be Milton Friedman or Karl Marx or Keynes to figure that out. The United States is running huge balance of payments deficits, right? Now, Bretton Woods had set up a fixed system of the dollar and the gold, all right? Which means that gold, $35 to an ounce. By 1968, the United States is running huge balance of payments deficits. If the United States is in a deficit, what are other countries in then? A surplus. And they have a surplus of dollars. Instead of a dollar gap, you now have a dollar glut or a dollar drain. Instead of these countries not having enough dollars, they now have too many dollars because of this BOP, balance of payments deficit. All right? Now, this is where I'm going to throw something else in, but don't panic. In the United States, the government had spent so much money by 1968 on the Vietnam War and on the Great Society, social programs, war on poverty, and so forth. What do you think that's done to the economy? If you have a massive expenditure, splurge, what's that going to do to the American economy? What kind of economic condition will that create? No, it'll overheat it. The government is spending so much money on military contracts, on soldiers, on Great Society programs that not hyperinflates, it inflates the economy, right? The United States, does that make sense? The U.S. is spending so much money on Vietnam and the Great Society that inflation results, right? If you start pumping a ton of money out there, if you start the printing press to start running, then the currency will be inflated, right? Inflated money, is it worth more or not as much as the base? It's not. It's worth less than, right? So what you have in the United States then is inflated money. Now, we're clear on that. Let's go to the next step, right? Tom DeGregory would be so proud, wouldn't he? So, you're conducting trade with, let's say, Europe, Britain, whoever, France, Italy, doesn't matter. They're paying in what currency? They're paying in dollars. Trade is being conducted in dollars, right? So, the United States is selling goods abroad. The United States dollar is inflated, right? However, when the Europeans pay for those American goods, what kind of dollars are they paying with? Are the Europeans paying with inflated dollars? No. They're paying with fixed dollars. Why? Because Bretton Woods has established a $35 per ounce of gold convertibility. Yes? It's actually to U.S. advantage. Because in the U.S., inflation means the dollar isn't worth as much, right? Okay, it's not worth as much, which means a dollar in circulation in the U.S. is going to be inflated, which means prices in the U.S., prices and wages are going up in the United States. In the U.S., prices are going up, okay? When that money goes, when those goods go to Europe, that's at an inflated price. The Europeans, however, aren't paying for it at that inflated price. They're paying for it at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. They're different. The Americans are exporting with cheap dollars, and the Europeans are importing with dear dollars. On one hand, they're inflated. On the other hand, they're fixed. Europe can't inflate. Europe cannot. In order for Europe to change the value of the dollar, they would have to revalue their own currency.
So therefore, then, we're getting profit from European import.
Absolutely. Bingo.
Then Europe goes into.
And this is where de Gaulle comes in. De Gaulle was furious. De Gaulle basically kept saying, we're paying for your freaking war. We're paying for Vietnam because you're exporting your inflation to us. We can't change. We can't revalue our franc. We can't revalue our pound. We can't revalue our lira because we have this Bretton Woods fixed system. It would be as if, if you're negotiating with me, I have fixed rates. You have floating rates. You can basically inflate yours. I'm at a disadvantage there. And I actually came up. I knew this would get weird, so that's why I have a graph down here, which I'll talk about in a minute. All right. So the United States was basically exporting its inflation. The Europeans, even though the American dollar is inflated, the Europeans don't get the advantage of that because they have to pay with fixed $35 per ounce of gold dollars. Going back, all right, and I'll in a minute I'll show you how this works. But a pound is worth $2.80. If the United States, if an American product valued at $2.80 is sold in Britain, it would go for £1 sterling. All right? Now, that product, if it's inflated, that 280 isn't really worth 280. In the United States, maybe it had been $2 and it's gone up to 280, so it's been inflated. In Britain, you're still paying £1 for that because the British exchange rate has not changed. And in fact, in November of 1967, it does change. The British actually are the first to act about this. They devalue the pound from 280 to 240, principally because they're running massive deficits as well, just like the United States is. What this means is that the post-war trading system is coming unglued. This is what ultimately it's all about, making trade stable. How do you make trade stable? You have a common currency. That common currency is the dollar, and to make it even more stable, we will back it in all cases with gold. I mean, it's really, this is not, I can understand this, it's not hard, because I don't know anything about this stuff. All right? So, by 1971, Nixon's president, you have about $50 billion being held abroad. All right? $50 billion. This is a major problem. The dollar drain, the dollar glut is the problem now, not the dollar gap. And the biggest complaint about this comes from France. In fact, what's is it the French Connection where they do the airplane heist of the gold? It's actually based on a true story. De Gaulle actually, you could do these transfers by wire, but de Gaulle, basically to kind of stick it to the U.S., actually sends Air France jets with dollars on them to pick up the gold and bring it back. What you have is a massive run, and this is where I think it's the French Connection. Is it the French? No, that's the drug thing. What movie is it that has the gold theft? It's based on a real thing that occurs at this time. The problem here is that as these countries get all of these dollars that are inflated, what are they going to do? They're going to go back, because what's the hedge against this? Gold. They're going to take these dollars and go back to the United States and cash them in. So what happens as a result of the balance of payments problem in the U.S., the inflation of the American dollar, all the Europeans who have too many dollars now start to cash them in for gold. And what does this do to the American gold reserves? It starts to deplete it. It had been something like 22 billion in the late 50s, and by 68 it's down to, is it 8 billion or something? I forget. It's a significant drain. Yeah, it's a significant drain. So all of this gold is flooding out of the United States. This is the backbone of the Bretton Woods system. So you can imagine then how this affects the United States. More and more dollars are going abroad to pay for military expenditures, to pay for private investment, to pay for commercial trade, the balance of payments, all that kind of stuff, right? And so there is a $50 billion outflow. Now, economic health depends on surpluses, not deficits. And what you see by 71 is $50 billion outflow. In addition to that, the dollar's value is decreased due to inflation. However, the gold standard keeps that $35 an ounce value fixed abroad. $35 will buy you an ounce of gold, will buy you whatever that currency is. In the case here, I did this just for kicks. In Britain, that'll get you 12.5 pounds. So $35 or 12.5 pounds will buy you an ounce of gold. So the dollar gap has become a dollar glut or a dollar drain. And by the 60s, the Europeans have many, many more dollars than they need for their reserve requirements. Just 10, 15 years earlier, they had a shortage, a glut, right? A gap, I'm sorry. They had a shortage, a gap. They needed dollars to buy stuff. Now they have too many dollars, which means that it's cheaper to purchase inflated American goods than it is for them to maintain their own economy. And increasingly, because they have too many dollars, they're converting them into gold. They're buying American gold. Now, if this continues, and this is the real fear, in 1968, Lyndon Johnson actually shuts down the international gold market for a week, for about a week, a few days, I can't remember. Like, I think 3-4 days, virtually a week, doesn't matter. Johnson shuts down the gold market, basically to stop the run on gold, to prevent these Europeans from cashing in their dollars, right? Yeah. Actually, that's what people are saying. This could be 1929 all over again. It's ironic. James didn't mention it, but during the Tet Offensive, things go really badly. And Westmoreland comes back and says, I want 206,000 more troops, right, in Vietnam. The main reason that Johnson rejects that, I mean, clearly, the war's going badly, and if things are, Westmoreland says, oh, everything's under control, then why do you need 206,000 troops? There's all kinds of reasons. The main reason Johnson turns down that request, he can't afford it. He can't pay for it, right? The run on American gold is so intense that essentially the world says to him, and Wall Street says to him, you got to stop this Vietnam thing. It's kind of, we're going backward here. But during Tet, not the real crisis, Tet's a real crisis, make no mistake about that. Tet is a huge crisis. But just as big, I would argue even more importantly, is this economic crisis. Ultimately, the world, the French, the British, and others, and importantly, Wall Street, go to the White House and say, you can't maintain this any longer. You have to quit spending all this money on Vietnam. You have to disengage. And that's one major reason you see Vietnamization. Vietnamization begins before Nixon. Johnson begins Vietnamization. He can't afford to pay for the war any longer. These are the limits of globalization. So you see the limits of military power in Vietnam, but more importantly, you see the limits of globalization. Because the United States, Tom McCormick, the guy I mentioned earlier, has a great, he said, I think I said this earlier, right? If you're global hegemon, the beauty of it is not only do you create the rules, but you create your own, and you don't have to play by the ones you've created. So, the rules talk about, this Bretton Woods system, but the United States is inflating its own currency and sending it abroad. And the Europeans are screaming bloody murder. We're paying for your inflation. We're paying for your war. And until it becomes a global economic crisis, until they start taking those dollars and cashing them in and depleting America's gold reserves, the U.S. is willing to get away with that. So now comes the part where I have the little stuff up here. If this conversion process where the Europeans bring all their dollars to the U.S. and take gold out, if this were to continue, the U.S. may find its gold reserves emptied out. Okay? Then what it would do? What would it do? It would essentially have to break from Bretton Woods and devalue the dollar. Why would it devalue the dollar? To protect gold. This is where all this comes on. I use $40 an ounce just because it's a round number. This is all speculative. It's my own thing. Right? It's not based on any kind of economic theory or anything like that. In order to devalue the dollar, that would mean that the dollar would have less value against the price of gold. So I use $40 an ounce just because I picked it out, because it's basically a round number. So if the U.S. devalues the dollar, let's say, and that's the example I have, if gold goes to $40 an ounce, European dollars are worth 1/7 less, right? Because instead of paying $35 for an ounce of gold, you would now pay $40 for an ounce of gold, which would mean, and multiply this by millions. An ounce of gold is nothing. We're talking about million tons, right? So multiply this by millions. That $5 an ounce difference multiplied by millions makes a huge difference. So the Europeans will be far less likely, won't they, to cash in their dollars if they're going to have to pay $40 for an ounce of gold as opposed to $35. That's not rocket science, okay? So if the United States continues to see gold flooding out of Fort Knox and elsewhere, then it might have to devalue the dollar to prevent that run on gold. But what will the Europeans do? And going back to the 30s, this is why people were afraid. It could be 1929, the 1930s all over again. If the U.S. devalues its dollar, makes the dollar worth less, what will that mean? Well, let me go to this. This is where this example came in. And I broke it down to really simple things. All right, this is the system. The Bretton Woods system is $35 an ounce, right? That means that $1 is worth, that means $1 is worth 0.028 ounces of gold. All right? Now, if you are in Britain, and again I use that because I know the exchange rate, 280, that would mean that you would get you would have to pay 0.35 pounds. I don't know what that is in terms of pence or whatever. Don't worry about it. So, you would pay about 1/3 of a pound to get $1. 0.35, a little over 1/3. Now let's say you devalue the dollar and you go to a $40 an ounce value for par. That means that $1 will now get you 0.025 ounces of gold, right? Which means that in Britain, something come undone? Okay. There we go. Which means that in Britain now you would spend 0.295 pounds for that same good. Now, the American dollar, let's say the Americans devalue the dollar. They are sending goods for trade to Britain. All right? At $35 you would spend 0.35 pounds. Now, at $40 you spend 0.295, which is less. 0.295 or 0.35, which is less? 0.295 is less. Which means that American goods going in to Europe will cost what? More or less if the dollar is devalued? No, they'll cost less. 295 is less than 35. So if you devalue the dollar to 40, all right, that means that in the UK you're going to be spending less, 0.295 versus 0.35, which means, how is that going to affect American trade? Are the Americans going to be selling more goods or less goods if they devalue the dollar? More, many, many more, because they're cheaper. What can the Europeans do according to Bretton Woods? Nothing. It's a fixed system. Does this make sense now?
You saved this till the next to the last class, so none of us would drop the class after you talked about this, right?
Well, first of all, it's not, no, this is for your information. This is look, this is not difficult. What? It's the United States' attempt to flood the European markets with goods. Why? The United States has a trade imbalance. It wants to create a trade deficit. How do you create a trade deficit? You sell your stuff cheaper. How do you sell your stuff cheaper? You devalue the dollar. This is all theoretical. This didn't happen, by the way, until 1971, all right, when Nixon actually goes off the whole thing. The point here is that if you devalue the dollar, American goods would cost less than they do. In this case, 0.295 as opposed to 0.35. If I could do pence and all that, it would be much easier. I just don't know what the conversion is, right? But, you know, if you have a choice of spending 0.295 or 0.35, you're going to spend 0.295. Are you going to spend 29 cents or 35 cents? If somebody has the same good, one's 29 and one's 35, which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the 29 center, all right? That's all this is. This isn't hard. This is not rocket science. 295 is less than 35. That's, I mean, it's just think 29 cents and 35 cents. Just think it that way. Jeez. Hey, I did this on a cocktail napkin. I wasn't even using a calculator. So if I can do that, you know, with, you know, all the hubbub of a coffee house around me, then. Now the other problem there is if the U.S. devalues this, it could lead to the Europeans doing what? The same thing. I mean, if the U.S. can break these rules, then so can the Europeans. You think they're going to sit there and let these cheaply priced American goods flood their market? No. So they'll probably devalue their currencies, devalue the pound, devalue the franc, devalue the mark, devalue the yen. Yes?
It wasn't also an issue here is that the oil was basically pegged to the U.S. dollar, so a change in value there would really affect that.
Everything's pegged to the U.S. dollar. Oil is pegged to the U.S. dollar, which is, of course, the greatest commodity, right? Foreign military spending is pegged to the dollar. You pay your soldiers and you pay for, you know, these offsets in dollars, right? So yeah, I mean, the whole global economy is based on the dollar. Oil is interesting. I know, like, you know, there's always this talk and these kind of, it's sort of a conspiracy theory, but not about, you know, OPEC going to the euro to pay for oil, which would be a huge blow to the United States, to you know, petroleum prices here in the States. You know, if you had to pay in euros, it'd be the same. Actually, that's a good, you know, I could have done the numbers on that. You know, right now, you pay for oil with dollars. OPEC is based on the dollars. If you go to euros, and the euro is what, $1.21, I think, right now, or something like that, you're paying a lot more. Instead of paying $1, you're paying $1.21. What's that going to do to fuel prices? And not just at the gas pump, but think of like airline fuel prices. That would devastate the American airline industry if OPEC started using the euro instead of the dollar. Okay, that should, I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? If you're paying $1.20, $1.21, or whatever it is, instead of $1. Okay, the euro started at $1, started at par. The initial offering of a euro was $1. It went up to 128. It's down to about 121. This is like, I know it's just crazy, weird stuff, but it's really important. You follow this. This is way more important than anything else, even though it's apparently not nearly as easy as I thought it was. So, if the U.S. provokes this round of devaluations, then the system of stable exchange rates, which was established at Bretton Woods in order to create a predictable pattern of global trade. Remember, Bretton Woods is about stability. This is what's important to all this. Stability. $35 per ounce per whatever that currency is stable. It doesn't change. It's fixed. So long as you're in a system of fixed exchange rates, this stuff isn't hard. Once it starts floating, that truly is complicated, and I'm not going to mess with that. That's why I basically quit doing my own research in '71, because at that point it is really difficult. I'm not sure how currencies float against each other. It is somewhat, it's kind of alchemy in that regard. But in here, it's pretty basic. It's fixed. If you can multiply, like, and divide by 35, you kind of got it, you know. So this could destroy the system. If this fails, the global trading system fails. What happened in 1929, 1930? Remember that chart I showed you several weeks ago? How trade dropped by more than a third from 29 to 33. From $3 billion to $900 million a year. Can you imagine an attendant decrease in the 60s and 70s if global trade drops that much? This undermines, shatters the whole system of globalization. And the point here is that globalization is dependent upon a strong, fixed, stable dollar to create a strong, fixed, stable global trading system. Now, the Europeans and the Japanese believe that this dollar is already overvalued because it was inflated because of Vietnam and Great Society spending. So they were reluctant to continue accepting dollars. All right? They didn't want any more. They had a glut. They had a drain. They didn't want any more dollars. Now, their point was the United States has to do something about this. It has to institute taxes or raise interest rates to make dollars more dear and less cheap. Right? So, I mean, I'm basically saying the same thing in a million different ways here. The real value of the dollar declines because of inflation, but the fixed value remains the same. That means, what I've said before, exports, and it says it right here, U.S. pays for exports from Europe or Japan with cheap dollars, with inflated dollars. Right? However, Europe and Japan pay for imports from the United States with dear dollars, with fixed dollars. All right? Now, one solution, which the U.S. did, and we mentioned this earlier, with the Marshall Plan, with the Dodge Plan, with NSC 68, not necessarily with NSC 68 in this regard, with the Marshall Plan, with the Dodge Plan, with the World Bank or Exim Bank. One thing the U.S. often does is to deflate the economy. How do you deflate an economy? How do you deflate it? You spend less money. You raise taxes. You have tighter interest, higher interest rates. Wage cuts, you reduce pay. Layoffs, basically austerity measures. Now, Whenever a third world country has an economic crisis, what does the IMF or the World Bank or the Marshall Plan in 47, 48, what do they insist upon? They insist upon these measures I've just mentioned. Tax hikes, spending decreases, layoffs, wage cuts, in order to slow down an overheated economy, right? But when you're hegemon, you can set the rules, but you don't necessarily have to play by them. The same thing that the US or the IMF would force, and always does force, on a third world country, it will not do to itself. The United States, basically in 68 through 71, would have required these kinds of measures in order to slow down this overheated economy. Not necessarily for US economic health, although inflation was a growing problem, really balloons because of the oil shocks of the 70s, but because of global economic harmony. And essentially what the US decides for a brief time is that, basically what the US decides is that the national economy is not as important as these transnational economic relationships. All right? So it wants to create a system not necessarily that's going to work for Americans, the American consumer, because it's not, or for the European consumer, because it's not really, although if they're buying in cheaply made American goods, then it might be. But basically, inflation means that the American working class is losing out. And 1970 marks kind of the high water mark if you look at the data on the American working class. People in 1970 made as much money as they make today when adjusted and figure it in for family income and things like that, all right? So this system isn't really working for the American consumer, but if you look at the data on American corporate interest, this is a period of great movement. You start to see banks set up subsidiaries. That goes up, I think, 1,000%. You start to see corporations open up subsidiaries and branches all over the world. So this is a period of incredible globalization, okay, because of this system here, all right? The United States would not take the steps that it would force on everybody else. The Americans don't play by the same rules. So all they did, the U.S. enacted a very brief surcharge on taxes and did some other voluntary stuff. It really didn't do much. Could the U.S. have done more? Well, one of the major problems behind this inflation was military spending for Vietnam. Is it going to cut military spending and maintain its power? No. Right? It can't do that because it would not be the global hegemon that it is. Can it slow down the economy with unemployment and wage cuts? Well, you could, but what then would working people do? Would they continue to maintain this consensus to go along with this system of military Keynesianism with a guns and butter economy? Would they continue to do that if you started massive layoffs and wage cuts? No. Right? Ultimately, actually, we find out through Maggie Thatcher and Reagan that in fact they will. But at the time, no one thought that was the case. Basically, people were still tied into the system of military Keynesianism. You have to maintain both guns and butter. So the United States does nothing in 68, 70, 71. They decide to let Europe deal with the problem. The Europeans finally revalue their own currencies. Japan does too. Nixon tries to force Europe and Japan to negotiate a new system of fixed rates. That falls apart. Point here, this is what I'm getting to. In August of 1971, Richard Nixon unilaterally devalues the dollar and suspends gold convertibility. Nixon kills off Bretton Woods. He just kills off Bretton Woods, devalues the dollar and ends gold conversion. He institutes a surcharge on imports. Why would you do that? A tariff, a duty. What's the point of that? Try to reduce imports to get a more favorable balance of trade. And he institutes domestic wage and price controls. Anybody recall those? Basically, there were limits on how much prices could go up or how much raises could go up, income. What's striking about that is Richard Nixon is from what political party? He is a Republican. Richard Nixon is a conservative Republican. And in August of 1971, what does Richard Nixon say? I guess we're all Keynesians now. Richard Nixon institutes wage and price controls. In 1979, amid horrific inflation that puts Vietnam-era inflation to shame, a group of labor leaders went to Jimmy Carter, allegedly a liberal Democrat, and demanded wage and price controls because inflation was just ridiculous. What, 19% or something outrageous? Jimmy Carter said no. Nixon and Ford did it. All right? Which is why I said Nixon is looking better all the time. Richard Nixon takes these measures to basically stop the bleeding. He unilaterally did this, kills off the Bretton Woods system. Now, the Europeans finally devised their own system. They began to float. EEC, the European Economic Community, begins to float its currencies against the dollar. So now what you have is a system in which global supply and demand, not political agreements, will determine the real purchasing value of the dollar. No longer will it be $35 per gold per whatever the currency adjustment rate is. It's now floating. It's real, the real value of a dollar versus the yen versus the mark versus whatever. The United States basically accepts this system. It gives up trying to stop the dollar drain. From that point on, I doubt, I could be wrong, the U.S. has ever had finished a year with a surplus in balance of payments. I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. I could be wrong, and I'll look it up. Basically, the U.S. at this point, this is kind of the end of the American economic empire. The U.S. relinquishes its industrial primacy. It no longer will be the manufacturer of the world. Where does manufacturing go to? This is where you start to see the emergence of Brazil and the so-called little tigers, Singapore and Korea. This is where you start to see manufacturing shift away. I mean, the United Steelworkers Union used to have 1 million members. It's down to about 90,000. Steel was the basis of American power for a century. I mean, take it from the railroad through the automobile, right, through the military-industrial complex. The steel industry, and if the steel industry is gutted, then you can kind of see what impact this has for the economy. So the U.S. relinquishes its role as the global industrial power, as manufacturing increasingly and jobs increasingly shift. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, which was a huge manufacturing area. Youngstown, Ohio was called the Ruhr Valley of the United States in the 20s and 30s. In the 70s, all of a sudden, man, the bottom fell out. And I mean, Youngstown lost 50,000 jobs in a matter of less than a decade. They initially go to places like Texas or like Mississippi. Why? What don't they have in Texas and Mississippi that they have in Youngstown? They don't have unions, right? So the union base in the United States. At one point after World War II, about a third of American workers were unionized. By this time, it goes down to today. I think it's less than 10%, isn't it? It's about 10 or 11, somewhere like that. So the high-paying, I sound like a campaign ad now, right? These high-paying industrial jobs flood away, initially to Mississippi and Texas and places like that where there aren't unions, then to places like Taiwan or Korea or Mexico or wherever, all right? This is all a product, I think, of the Vietnam era because the U.S. so badly miscalculated the global economy and started spending so much money creating this hyperinflation in Vietnam. It kind of guts the whole thing. So the United States essentially loses this role of industrial manufacturing giant and as the providing commodities for foreign markets. I mean, it used to be that the United States would make goods that it could sell overseas. It basically throws up its hands in 1971. It accepts a transformation into what critics often call, and I agree with them, a rentier economy. Anybody ever heard that word, rentier? It basically kind of is what it looks like, renter. The United States, instead of producing goods and selling them, lives off the income of rents. And what are rents? In this case, it's not renting out, slum apartments, right? Direct and indirect overseas investments. The U.S. is living off the profits it makes from investments abroad. What does the U.S. export now? Does it export goods? What does it really export? Money. The United States in the 1970s becomes an exporter of money. It is a rentier economy. Does the export of money create jobs or higher wages or a higher standard of living? No. Okay? Any questions on that? Because I can actually kind of come close to finishing, and I do want to talk about some of this stuff. So what's the substitute for that? I mean, all hell's broken loose. The United States no longer makes anything. It doesn't provide anything. Because of Vietnam, it's had to dramatically reduce defense spending. It's sending dollars overseas. It guts the Bretton Woods system. Gold is no longer convertible. The dollar's devalued. It's apocalyptic, right? We're all Keynesians now, saith Richard E. Nixon, right? Well, Nixon isn't dumb. He actually has a substitute. It becomes, ding, 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 military Keynesianism. We are all Keynesians now. The U.S. needs to continue manufacturing. It's not going to sell steel, okay? It's not going to sell automobiles. It can no longer do that. I mean, this is when you start to see Japanese cars, for instance, flood the American market. It's a big uproar. You know, I'm of a certain age, so I remember, like, if you saw a VW on this, you know, like a Bug, you're like, wow, look at that. And if you saw a Japanese car, it was like, whoa, I can't believe there's a Japanese car in Ohio, right? I mean, you know, by the mid to late 70s, they're all over the place. I remember one of my first summer jobs was actually working at a Packard Electric, was a subsidiary of GM, and I remember I drove a Ford, and they wouldn't let me park in the parking lot because I had a Ford. You know, so a Japanese car, you would have had your window shattered in the parking lot at the time. So what does Nixon do? Another one of my diversions. He sells guns. If you can't have guns and butter, you make the guns, right? I want you to take a look at these later because I'm going to go through them very quickly because I actually have a chance. I've never done this. I actually made it through everything, right? I'm so damn proud of myself. Military, and this goes back to the way I started. It all comes round. Militarization becomes a substitute for development, all right? And these are just various charts here, which don't tell me they're not going to show up. Whew. All right. This is a military aid to foreign governments, and this is the kind of explanation of what they are. And, you know, obviously the numbers will tell you a lot. But you can kind of see. Go out again. How'd that happen? Okay. All right. You know, I would suggest you take a look at these just for your own, you know, kind of enjoyment and pleasure. But you can kind of see, you know. Oh. Yeah. I don't even know. Can you even make out those numbers? Okay. Let me see if this. Wait a minute. This should help. Well, sort of. All right. Anyway, you get the point. Yeah, it's almost over. I mean, if you look at the country, you know, Brazil, you know, 646 million. You know, it kind of, the story kind of tells itself, right? Egypt, as a way to contain Arab nationalism, the U.S. actually, well, Nasser dies in 1970, Sadat takes over, so Egypt becomes a major recipient of U.S. aid, and you can see the numbers there, quite high, you know, 4.8. Israel, 14 million, which I think is probably the biggest number you're going to see on this whole chart. Indonesia, did it go out again? Okay, well, Indonesia, big recipient of aid. Arms sales and military aid to countries considered human rights violators. I did this in particular because even though I haven't talked about it, Jimmy Carter was president who talked a lot about human rights, yet if you look at the numbers, these are countries which have been deemed human rights violators, and look at the amount of U.S. arms that goes to these countries, you know, significant numbers. Military aid to selected recipients. This is actually probably an easier chart. South Vietnam, not surprisingly, the biggest, but Israel, Korea, Turkey. Look at those numbers, you know, so $74 billion. Right? These are trends in the 70s. What's really something is if you look at the numbers from 71 to 79, they basically in that 10-year period outpace what you saw from 50 to 71. And again, they're really, you know, huge. 97 million or 97. Wait a second. U.S. dollars and 97,000 million. What's that? 97 billion, right? 97 billion. $20 billion in credits. Something else when you're doing this that's important is if you look at the amount of military aid is actually far more important than military equipment. Military sales often are prorated over a long period. So you'll buy helicopters, but you actually won't get them for 10 years. So the amount of military equipment is actually not nearly as great. Look at military aid. That's a far, I think, more important number. And this ties into what we talked about earlier, training of military personnel. But look at these numbers. 40,000, several thousand, 25,000 Taiwan, 34,000 Korea. The point here is that Nixon especially uses this as a substitute. Nixon has to find some way to send American goods overseas. So what's he do? He does it via a massive arms trade. The United States, in the mid-60s, the United States was selling abroad about $1 or $2 billion yearly in weapons. By 72, barely 5-6 years later, that number increases tenfold to about 10 or 12 billion a year. How does Nixon make up for the demobilization of Vietnam? How does Nixon make up for this dollar drain? How does he do it? He militarizes the world. This has catastrophic consequences. Why can Indonesia go into Timor and slaughter 200,000 people? Because they're armed by the Americans. Why can basically every side in every civil war in Africa continue fighting against each other? Because the U.S. is selling weapons to all of these countries. Why can the Iranians and the Iraqis both have major arsenals? Because they're both getting weapons from the United States. All right? So clearly then, Nixon's solution to this global economic crisis is to further militarize the world through this series of arms deals. All right? This brings us up to the Nixon years. I still need to talk about globalization in the Middle East. We still have stuff to do. But, you kind of get a sense now, I think, of where the post-war world ended. This is really a transformative time, the 70s. Things are different after that, and we're going to talk about that. But from the Cold War to the 70s, you have kind of a clearly defined period, and now it's changing. Right? It's a different world. The Cold War is different. The global system and globalization are different. And we'll talk about that next time.